The morning Major Harwick threw Sergeant Nora Lane's service record across the briefing table. Not at her, not exactly, but close enough that the corner caught her cheekbone. The 11 men in the room went completely still. "Pick it up," he said. She didn't. Harwick was 53 years old, built like someone had assembled him out of things that were supposed to be temporary, but never got replaced. He had run this advanced reconnaissance and targeting course for 16 years. In 16 years, he had washed out 41% of every cohort that passed through the doors of Canadian Forces Base Gagetown. He had never had a female candidate reach the final evaluation block. He had also never, in 16 years, had anyone not pick up what he threw. "Sergeant Lane," he said again. Her rank, her name, precisely spaced. The way you say something when you want it to feel like the last warning before a consequence. She looked at the papers on the floor. Then she looked at him. Her eyes, the men in that room would remember later, were not defiant. They were not afraid. They were something harder to name and much harder to manage. The eyes of a person who has already decided that whatever happens next, they can absorb it. She left the papers on the floor. Harwick leaned in close enough that she could feel the heat off his face. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I've broken better than you. I've broken men who made you look like a weekend exercise. You will not last this week." He straightened. He looked at the 11 candidates arranged around the briefing table. He walked to the front of the room and began his opening address as if nothing had happened. What the men in that room would think about later, and they would think about it, each of them, for years, was not that she had refused. It was that she had done it without any visible effort. No tension in her jaw, no bracing in her shoulders. As though she had anticipated exactly this, had already made her peace with it, and was simply present for whatever came next. The papers stayed on the floor for the entire briefing. Nobody touched them but her. Eventually, when the room was empty, she gathered each page with the same care she gave everything, set the file straight, placed it on the table. Then she went to find her bunk. She had arrived at Gagetown on a Wednesday, which felt neither right nor wrong to her. Lane was not the kind of person who assigned meaning to days of the week. She was 31 years old, 5'8", 141 pounds, of the kind of physical conditioning that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She had spent the previous 8 years as a combat arms soldier with the Royal Canadian Regiment, with 2 rotations in Eastern Europe, under a NATO mission designation she was not permitted to discuss in detail, and 1 deployment to West Africa that officially had not occurred in the way it had occurred. She had a scar along her left forearm from a piece of shrapnel that had changed trajectory in a way the laws of physics should not technically have allowed. She had a commendation she kept in a cigar box under her cot. She had the quiet of someone who had learned that most conversations were less informative than the silences between them. The other candidates were already assembled outside the main training building when she walked up. 12 men, Rangers, infantry, 1 Royal Marine on exchange, a para from the airborne school. Every one of them selected from the top percentile of the top percentile. Every one of them looking at her the way people look at something that doesn't belong in the frame. A master corporal named Petrov, not the Petrov from 2RCR, a different one, taller, with a scar above one eye he'd collected somewhere that wasn't on any form, leaned toward the man beside him and said, "Just loud enough? This a pilot program or something?" The man beside him, a sergeant named Ruiz, didn't answer. He didn't disagree either. Lane heard it. She always heard things. Her mother used to say she had been born listening, that even as a child she had the habit of going still when a room changed, of picking up frequencies that most people filtered out because they had learned not to bother. Her mother had not been a soldier. She had been a school teacher in Trenton, Ontario, which was the kind of town built around a military base in a way that means the base and the town share a nervous system. Her mother had understood the military the way civilians understand weather, as a condition that governed the texture of daily life without being something you controlled. Her father had been weather. Warrant Officer, 2nd Class Dale Lane, Royal Canadian Regiment, retired after 22 years. Scout sniper, a man who said approximately 40 words a day and meant every one of them. He had died the previous spring in his armchair, facing the window, the way men like him sometimes arrange to go, with dignity and privacy and the last light on their face. She had held his hand. He had looked at her near the end and he had said, in a voice that was mostly breath by then, "You already know more than I taught you. The rest is just distance." She thought about that a lot. She was thinking about it now, standing at attention with 11 men who hadn't decided what she was yet, and a major who had already decided and was wrong. She waited. Harwick came out, and the morning changed temperature without getting any colder. The course was called the Canadian Forces Advanced Targeting and Reconnaissance Program, CFTARP, which everyone called it something else, something with the same initials that was not polite. It ran 12 weeks, including a final evaluation block in the northern training areas that involved conditions that did not appear in any recruitment brochure. The attrition rate was real. Harwick had not invented the 41%. He had, over 16 years, carefully cultivated it, not through cruelty exactly, but through the particular conviction that softening the program was the same as failing its graduates, that the people who left were protected by their leaving, that the ones who stayed were the ones who should. This was the story he had told himself for a long time. What he had never fully examined was who the story was designed to protect. Week 1 broke 2 men, 1 stress fracture, 1 voluntary withdrawal on day 5. A ranger named Fenn from Edmonton, who had been the strongest candidate on paper, and who sat down during a midnight land navigation exercise in the rain and simply did not get up again. The instructors had stood nearby and waited, and eventually one of them had walked off and come back with the paperwork. And Fenn had signed it with the expression of someone who has finally admitted a thing they had known for a while. Lane absorbed all of it. She was not unaffected. She would have been lying to claim otherwise, and she did not make a habit of lying to herself about the cost of things. She was running on less sleep than her body wanted, and more cold than the body of anyone rational would have accepted. The physical load was manageable. It was the relentlessness that reached down into something deeper than muscle, the total absence of any moment where the environment gave her permission to breathe out fully. But she had a mechanism. Her father had called it the quiet room, a mental space, the part of your mind where the noise couldn't get to if you'd done the work to build the walls. He'd built his over 22 years. In hide positions in the Balkans, in the flat gray patience of surveillance operations that lasted days, in the long hours where doing nothing correctly was the whole assignment. The body will cooperate with almost anything you ask it to do, he had told her once. It's the mind that collapses first. So you build a room in your mind where collapse can't reach you, you furnish it, you know where everything is, and when the outside gets unbearable, you go there. She went there a lot in week 1, and from inside that quiet room, she watched. She watched the instructors. She watched the patterns and how they applied pressure, not randomly, not even approximately randomly, but with a logic that revealed itself over time. Pressure that spiked at the moments of highest performance, not the moments of failure, but the moments of excellence, as though excellence itself was the thing that needed correcting. She filed that observation carefully. She did not yet know what to do with it. She met Strand at the end of week 2. He was 26 years old, from Cape Breton, NS, and he was technically one of the finest shots she had seen in a formal training environment. His groupings on the range were exceptional. His understanding of wind and environment was instinctive, in the way that sometimes happens in people who grew up hunting and never had to unlearn what they already knew. His problem was observation. The moment he knew he was being assessed, something in him disconnected. His breathing changed. His trigger pull went from smooth to halting. His groups opened up by 30%, 40, sometimes more. It was like watching someone who could play guitar perfectly in an empty room suddenly lose access to their own hands the moment someone sat down to listen. Lane recognized it. She had carried the same thing at 23 in her first advanced marksmanship course at Meaford. A staff sergeant named Colquhoun, who communicated primarily through exhaling and who smelled permanently of coffee and machine oil, had looked at her groupings on day 3 and said with characteristic economy, "You shoot like you're afraid of being caught doing it right." She had wanted to argue. She couldn't because he was right. She found Strand on the range at dusk after the formal day ended, running dry fire drills alone in the fading light. "You're holding your breath wrong," she said. He startled. She moved quietly, by habit, a habit so ingrained she no longer noticed it happening. "You've got a hunter's hold," she said. "Breath control before the shot, full arrest, the way you would for whitetail at 150 meters. It works at close range. At 300 and beyond, it works against you. You're not controlling your breathing, you're fighting it." He looked at her. He was clearly unsure how to receive this. A woman 3 years older, who had spent 2 weeks mostly staying out of the way of things that were aimed at her, offering correction that landed with the precision of someone who had thought about it for a long time. "How do you know?" he said. "Because I did it for a year before someone told me," she said. "A sniper doesn't hold. You find the natural pause at the bottom of the exhale, between the lungs emptying and beginning to fill again. That's the window, half a second, maybe less. You learn to fire inside it." He looked at his rifle. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. It was a fair question. The course was not a cooperative structure. Helping another candidate survive was, on paper, working against your own ranking. "Because I was raised that way," she said simply. And she left him to practice. The next morning, his groupings tightened by 35%. His primary instructor, a warrant officer named Doyle, noticed it immediately and said nothing. But his expression said the kind of something that doesn't require words. By the end of week 2, the dynamics of the cohort had shifted, fractionally, almost imperceptibly, but shifted. The problem started in week 3. It started with her data book. Lane maintained meticulous range records. Every shot, every environmental condition, every adjustment. She had done so since she was 18. Not because she was told to, but because her father had told her that a sniper who trusted memory over record was a sniper who would eventually miss the most important shot of their career. After the long-range qualification block, a multi-position engagement exercise at ranges from 800 to 1,200 meters. She ran her own analysis of her score before the official posting. She had hit clean, she knew the numbers. She had run them twice. When the posted scores appeared, she was listed 9th out of 12. The methodology note cited positional discipline concerns that had not been referenced in any evaluation rubric she had access to and had not appeared on any other candidate's scorecard. Petrov, who had finished behind her in time and had dropped one target she had not, was listed 4th. She looked at the board for a long time. Then she looked again, because she wanted to be absolutely certain about what she was seeing before she decided anything. She was certain. Ruiz came and stood beside her. He looked at the board. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that wasn't comfortable to carry. "That doesn't match what I saw," he said quietly. "I was in the adjacent lane for 3 of those positions. Your positional discipline was textbook." She looked at him. He said, "I'm not saying this because of anything. I'm saying it because it's accurate." "I know," she said. "What are you going to do?" She looked at the board one more time. "Keep shooting," she said. She filed a formal performance discrepancy notice through the chain of command. Not because she believed it would change the score. She had been a soldier long enough to understand how institutions metabolize challenges to their own processes. She filed it because documentation was a different kind of weapon, one that didn't fire loudly, that was easy to overlook, that tended to matter later in ways you couldn't always predict at the time of loading. 2 days after that, Harwick called her to his office. It was a small room. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out at the range, a photograph on the wall from an exercise she didn't recognize. He was standing when she entered, looking at the photograph the way people look at something when they're using the act of looking to finish a thought before they have to deal with something they'd rather not deal with. She stood at attention and waited. He sat down. The performance review methodology, he said, was applied consistently across all candidates. A pause. Experienced evaluators identify elements that raw scores don't fully capture. "With respect, sir," she said, "I'd like to know specifically what positional concerns were observed and whether they were documented during the exercise or after the composite was calculated." Something moved across his face, not anger. Something more complicated than anger. The expression of a man who had anticipated a response, but not this particular one, and didn't have a ready answer for it. "Are you making an allegation, Sergeant?" "No, sir. I'm asking a procedural question. I'd like to know what was observed and when it was documented. Those seem like reasonable questions for a candidate to ask about a score that materially affected her standing." The silence between them was the kind that has mass. "You're further from the finish line," Harwick said finally, "than you think you are." It wasn't a threat. It had the shape of a threat. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm aware of that." He dismissed her. She walked out into the November air. Gagetown in November is serious about winter. The kind of cold that arrives before the calendar gives permission, and stood for exactly 30 seconds and let herself feel what she hadn't shown him. The exhaustion. The specific grinding weight of being the most precise person in the room and having to fight for the right to be acknowledged as adequate. 30 seconds. Then she walked back to the barracks and cleaned her rifle, because there was still a great deal of range left to cover, and a final evaluation in the northern block that had never been completed by a female candidate, and it had been waiting long enough. The discrepancy notice did not disappear. Institutions, in Lane's experience, were not good at making things disappear. They were good at delaying things, reclassifying things, placing things into categories that made them harder to locate. But the paper existed, it was in the system. And Harwick, whatever else he was not a man who allowed splinters to remain unexamined. 3 days after their meeting, he called the cohort to a full assembly at 0445. Not a training evolution. An assembly, candidates standing in formation in the dark, breath visible, nobody knowing why they were there except that they were. Harwick walked out and stood in front of them for a long moment without speaking. This program, he said finally, has a performance review process that exists for one reason: to identify the candidates who can function at the highest level under conditions that most soldiers never encounter. The process is not perfect. No process is. What it is rigorous. What it is not is a mechanism for candidates to dispute their evaluations based on personal disagreement with the result. He walked along the front of the formation. He did not look at her. He didn't need to. Every eye that dared to move slid toward her for exactly 1 second before snapping back to the front. In 17 years, he said, I have never had a candidate formally challenge this program's evaluation process. In 17 years. The process does not owe you a particular outcome. It owes you honest assessment, and honest assessment sometimes confirms that a candidate is not where they need to be. He stopped. He was standing in front of her. Are we clear, Sergeant Lane? Yes, sir, she said. Her voice was perfectly level. He held the pause for 3 full seconds, long enough to become a performance for the 11 men watching. Then he walked away. What he didn't see, because his back was already turned, was Petrov. Petrov was standing 4 positions to her left. He had been one of the first voices of skepticism on day 1. He looked at the back of Harwick's retreating figure. Then he looked at Lane. What was in his face was not sympathy. Petrov did not appear to have been built for sympathy. It was something closer to recognition, the expression of a man who has just watched something unjust happen in front of him and is beginning, against his preference, to have opinions about it. She didn't look back at him. She filed the moment away with everything else and waited for the formation to break. Week 4 was environmental integration, reading the world between the shooter and the target, and folding that information into a decision that had no margin for error. Wind, obviously, but also thermal gradients, mirage. The way terrain features influenced air movement in ways that standard calculation methodology didn't fully capture. The way conditions that seemed identical at the firing line could vary enormously at the target, and the distance between those two truths was where most shots were lost. It was, in Lane's private assessment, the most honest part of the curriculum. It was where raw technical skill became insufficient on its own. You could be perfect in every controllable element and still miss if you didn't understand what the air was doing in the space you couldn't see. The lead instructor for the block was a master warrant officer named Sinclair. He was methodical, patient in the way that good teachers are patient, not as a performance of tolerance, but as a genuine orientation toward the moment when someone understands. He taught by asking questions that led candidates to find the answer themselves, which was slower and more effective than handing it to them. On the second day, he stood at the head of the group on a hillside above the river valley and asked without preamble, "What's the wind doing at the target?" The target was at 900 meters. There were flags at the line, at 400, at 600. No flag at the target. 7 candidates offered extrapolations from the visible flags. Reasonable interpolations, defensible numbers. Strand said nothing. He was watching the tree line along the river's edge. Lane said nothing. She was watching something else, a hawk, hovering at approximately target distance, its primary feathers making constant micro-adjustments, not circling, hovering, holding a position in air that was actively trying to move it. Sinclair waited. Then, Lane, what are you reading? The hawk, sir. Why the hawk? Because it's working harder than it should be if the wind were what the flags are showing. Those flags are mounted at 2 meters off the ground. The wind at that height is not necessarily the wind at center mass for a standing target or bipod height for a prone engagement. The hawk is compensating against a crosswind component at approximately 4 meters elevation, and the angle of its compensation is showing me something about the valley's air drainage pattern that the flags can't. The river is funneling colder air from the north at lower elevation, which is creating a gradient that's bending the surface level wind, reading left. The actual crosswind at target level is probably 6 to 8 degrees stronger and slightly different in direction than the flags indicate. Silence. What's your correction? Sinclair asked. She gave him the number. He nodded once. Not effusively, the single nod of a man who has received an accurate answer and intends to acknowledge it with exactly the amount of acknowledgement it deserves. To the group. Flags are a starting point, he said. They are data. They are not the full picture. That night, Strand came and sat across from her in the barracks common area. He was quiet the way young soldiers are quiet when they've been working up to something they're not certain they have the right to say. The hawk, he finally said. She didn't look up from the boar brush she was running. My dad hunts, she said. He used to say that animals are reading the environment before you arrive, and they'll keep reading it after you leave. They don't have the option of being wrong. So if you want to know what something is actually doing, watch something that depends on knowing. Strand was quiet, processing that. He sounds like he was something else, he said carefully. He was, she said, and her voice on that one short phrase went somewhere different than the rest of it, something softer. Then it came back. He was a sniper. 2 years. Scout. He used to say that everything he knew about reading ground he learned sitting in a deer blind with me when I was 7 years old, before any formal instruction touched it. Did he know you'd end up here? She set the boar brush down. He asked me to promise him 3 things, she said. Not for his sake. He wasn't that kind of man. He asked because he believed I could, and he didn't want me to not do it because someone else decided I couldn't. She picked the brush back up. He was right about the second part, she said quietly. The first part is still being determined. Strand nodded. He started to stand, then stopped. For what it's worth, he said, every guy in this group knows you're the best technical shooter here. Even the ones who haven't said it. Especially the ones who haven't said it. She looked at him directly. That's kind, she said. It's also not the problem. He didn't entirely understand that yet. He would. The problem came in week 5, and it arrived with a precision that she almost had to respect. The dual stress protocol, simultaneous physical and psychological pressure, designed to identify candidates whose decision-making deteriorated under compound degradation, was a legitimate tool. Real sniper operations required decision-making under exactly this kind of compounding. The course needed to know who held together and who came apart. Her version of the protocol had a modification. She didn't know about it until she was already inside it. The physical phase routed her through a section that added approximately 6 minutes to her transition time. She didn't realize it was different from the standard route until she noticed, partway through, that her route marker color didn't match the markers she had memorized from the morning walkthrough. She was already committed. She completed the physical phase at maximum effort, transitioned to the precision engagement block with less time than the standard window allowed, and hit 5 of 6 targets before the clock ended. 5 of 6, under deliberately altered conditions, still a passing score. In the debrief, a captain named Quinn she had not previously dealt with, which itself was notable, asked her to walk through her decision-making process. She did so accurately and completely. Quinn made notes. Then, do you feel your result reflected your actual capability today? No, sir. Why not? Because my route through the physical phase differed from the standard route in a way that reduced my available engagement time, which reduced my score. I memorized the standard route this morning during the walkthrough. I also memorized the route I was actually sent on. I can walk you through the differences. Quinn set his pen down. That's a significant claim, Sergeant. I'm happy to document it. I have the route markers memorized. A pause. Both routes? Quinn said. I paid attention this morning, she said. Another pause, longer. The score was posted that evening, 5 of 6, with a notation about extended transition time exceeding the standard window. No mention of route variance. The following morning, Petrov found her before PT. He held up his phone without saying anything first. On the screen was a photograph, one he had taken during the walkthrough the previous morning. It showed 2 sets of route markers clearly diverging at a junction point. I thought it was a range setup error, he said. I took this because I figured you'd notice it too, and I wanted to have it in case it mattered. He paused. It mattered, he said. He put the phone in his pocket. I'm going to Sinclair with this, he said. You can come with me or not. That's your decision. He turned and walked. Ruiz, who had been standing nearby and had seen the whole thing, put down his coffee and walked after Petrov without saying a word. Lane stood in the corridor for a moment, then she followed. What happened in Sinclair's office was not dramatic. He looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. He asked a few questions. He photographed the photograph with his own phone. He thanked them and told them to return to the barracks. And the expression on his face as they left was the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head who wasn't satisfied with the total. Harwick called her to his office that evening. She had expected something combative. She had prepared for it internally, without showing it, the way you prepare for a wave you can see forming a long way out. What she found was different. Harwick was sitting behind his desk, and he looked, for the first time in 5 weeks, and tired. Not physically, that kind was familiar, the other kind. The kind that comes from carrying something for too long without setting it down, and starting to feel the weight accumulating. He didn't speak for almost 40 seconds after she entered. The root variance, he said finally, has been classified as an administrative error in root marker placement. She said nothing. Your dual stress protocol score will be recalculated against the standard window. He paused. The adjusted score reflects a full 6 of 6 engagement. She said nothing. He looked at her then. For the first time in 5 weeks, he looked at her not as a problem that needed managing or a challenge that needed containing, but as one person looks at another when something between them has cracked at without either of them fully intending it to. Is there anything you'd like to say? He asked. No, sir. He nodded slowly. As though that answer, controlled, flat, stripped of any performance, confirmed something for him. Dismissed. She walked out into the hallway and put her back against the wall and closed her eyes for 10 seconds. Just 10. In those 10 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what 5 weeks had cost her. Not in rankings, not in assessments. In the sustained, grinding expenditure of energy required to stay intact when the pressure had been calibrated specifically to her breaking point. 10 seconds. Then she walked back to the barracks because there were still 3 weeks of training remaining. And somewhere in the Northern Evaluation Block, a qualification standard that had not been achieved by a female candidate in the full history of this program was waiting. It had been waiting long enough. The final block was held at a remote training area 4 hours north of Gagetown, in terrain that the Canadian Shield had built over several 100 million years without any particular concern for what humans would eventually try to do with it. 12 candidates had left Gagetown. 1 additional withdrawal during transit paperwork. 11 candidates arrived at the Northern Block on a Sunday morning when the sky was doing something complicated with light that it does in November in Northern Ontario. Neither dark nor bright, committed to neither. The qualification standard involved, among other elements, a precision engagement at a range that the program documentations described as a theoretical maximum, the outer edge of what the combination of physics, equipment, and human skill could be expected to achieve under operational field conditions. The target had been installed when the Northern Evaluation Facility was constructed 28 years ago. It had been engaged by every qualifying cohort since. It had been hit once, and that hit had subsequently been disqualified on a technicality so fine-grained that most of the instructors who had been there at the time still argued about it. For practical purposes, the standard was 0, 28 years, not once. Harwick briefed the cohort at the target range on day 2, standing with his back to the valley below and the gray sky above. He had a way of positioning himself relative to landscape that communicated authority without performing it. He had done it so long it was instinct. The target, he told them, rent a condition that exists at the edge of what this program considers achievable. It exists not to be defeated, but to define the limit. He paused. In 28 years, this program has sent over 600 candidates through this block. Every cohort attempts this qualification. No candidate has achieved a confirmed hit. He looked across the 11 faces in front of him. This is not a criticism of those candidates. They were exceptional soldiers. Many of them are serving in roles right now that most people in this country will never hear about. The standard is not unmet because the candidates were inadequate. It is unmet because the environmental conditions at this target, the valley topography, the thermal variables, the wind behavior, create a ballistic problem that standard calculation methodology cannot fully solve. A pause. Physics, he said simply, defines the limit. And then, as though it were an afterthought, and nothing Harwick said was an afterthought, he looked directly at Lane. Just that, just the look. Every candidate present received the same message from that look, at the same frequency, whether Harwick intended them to or not. Strand, walking beside her back down to the range, said quietly, "That was meant for you." "I know," she said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. It lights something in me, she said. Whether that's useful depends on what I do with it. Petrov fell into step on her other side. He said nothing for a moment. Then, he's setting the story before the shot happens. Whatever you do tomorrow, he wants the narrative already written. I know, she said. So what's your story? Petrov said. She looked ahead. Same one it's always been, she said. That evening, after training ended, Lane went alone to the valley rim, not toward the target. She went to the high ground above and between, sat down on a shelf of exposed granite, and watched. She watched for 2 hours. The wind in that valley did not behave the way textbook wind behaved. The valley walls created compression patterns that interacted with each other in ways that were genuinely complex, not impossible to understand, but requiring a different kind of attention than flags and interpolation tables could give you. From the firing line, you saw one version of what was happening. From above, watching the actual movement of air as told by the behavior of snow crystals lifting off the rock faces, by the bent shapes of the sparse spruce at the valley's edges, by the way a raven was working a thermal near the far wall, you saw something more complete. Her father had told her once, sitting on a ridge in the Gatineau Hills watching a valley below, the best thing you can do is watch the same ground at different times, in different light. The ground doesn't change. Your understanding of it does. She watched. At 53 minutes into her watch, she saw it for the first time. A pattern in the snow lifting off the valley floor. Not random, not linear, but rotational. The lower valley was forming a thermal pocket that cycled. She watched it complete one rotation and started counting. Watched it complete again. 14 seconds? Another, 14. A half second of variance either way, which was consistent with ambient temperature fluctuation. She counted it 8 more times. 14 seconds, 14 seconds, 14. This was not chaos. This was not the unpredictable environmental variable that Harwick had described as the reason physics defined the limit. This was a pattern, hidden, subtle, requiring the particular patience of someone who had been taught from childhood that watching was not the same as looking, but a pattern, and patterns had solutions. Her heart rate went up by about 12 beats per minute. She brought it back down deliberately. Not yet. She had identified a variable. She had not yet determined what to do with it. She needed to understand what the rotating thermal pocket did to a round traveling through its lower boundary at this range. She needed to know the bullet's time of flight. She needed to identify the specific point in the 14-second cycle where the air in the critical zone moved briefly parallel to the bullet's path rather than across it, and how long that window lasted. She sat on the granite rim in the dark and the cold and did the mathematics in her head for another hour. When she walked back toward the facility, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees from the afternoon. Sinclair was outside the operations hut. He watched her come in from the direction of the valley without asking where she'd been. He just watched, and he didn't go inside until she'd passed. The final qualification day arrived before first light. Lane was awake before the alarm. She lay in the dark for 60 seconds, breathing, doing nothing else, letting the day arrive before she went to meet it. Then she got up. 11 candidates assembled at the firing line at 0730. The valley stretched ahead in the flat gray morning light. The qualification standard target was invisible at this distance without optics, which was part of the point. The rules were simple. 1 shot per candidate, no coaching, instructors present to observe, and if necessary, to confirm. Harwick stood slightly apart from the group. He had said nothing directly to her that morning. He had looked at her the way he looked at the others. But something in his posture told Sinclair, who was watching both of them with the attention he gave targets, that Harwick was bracing for something, and that the bracing was the tell of a man who had already started revising a certainty without admitting it to himself. The first candidate stepped to the line. A ranger named Brandt composed technically excellent, top 3 in the cohort on paper. He took his environmental assessment, applied his calculations, fired, misdrifted right. The valley took it. Second candidate, miss high into the rock face above the target. By the 5th miss, the weight on the firing line had become something physical, collective, the particular density of a group of excellent people, understanding that the thing in front of them is genuinely difficult, and that individual excellence alone is not sufficient. Petrov shot 7th. He spent 40 seconds on his read. He adjusted, he fired. The round hit low and left of the target, by what the spotter estimated, at 4 meters. Petrov stood up from his position, looked at the impact point, and said one word that nobody later repeated but everyone heard. Then he stepped back. He looked at Lane. The bottom of the valley is doing something the flags aren't showing, he said. I think the air drainage off the eastern wall is creating a deflection below the line of sight. I know, she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. You figured it out, he said. Last night. On the valley rim? Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then go hit it, he said. Not encouragement, a statement. The way Petrov said everything he actually meant. Flat, direct, without decoration. Candidates 8 through 10 shot in sequence. One came close, Strand, whose round Sinclair estimated at just over a meter right of center before the valley's rotation pulled it clear. Strand stepped back and looked at the impact point and looked at Lane and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that she hadn't already understood. Then there was one candidate left. Harwick stepped forward. His voice carried across the full firing line. No candidate in 28 years has achieved this qualification, he said. The conditions are not a matter of effort or preparation. They represent a genuine physical limit. He looked directly at her. Physics, he said, defines this. The same words as the day before, harder now, sharper. A final construction erected specifically for her to run into. Lane stepped to the line. She did not look at Harwick. She did not look at the candidates behind her, or the instructors, or the flags that had already failed 10 experienced soldiers this morning. She stepped to the line, lowered herself into position, and the world, the loud, complicated, exhausting world she had been navigating for 6 weeks, went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The difference mattered. Quiet was the room her father had taught her to build when she was young enough that the teaching had become architecture rather than memory. Sinclair moved to the spotting scope. He had spotted for hundreds of candidates on this program over 11 years. His face behind the eyepiece gave nothing, but his right hand, resting on his knee, had closed slowly into a loose fist. Doyle stood 6 feet to Sinclair's right. He was not writing on his clipboard. Harwick stood 12 feet back from the instructor group, arms at his sides, watching. The 10 candidates who had already shot arranged themselves in the way soldiers arrange themselves around something that matters. Not a formal formation, something more organic. The unconscious gravitational pull of people toward a center they recognize as significant. Strand was near the left edge. His hands had stopped shaking. He had told her 3 days ago, on the transport, that his hands shook from the waiting. He was not waiting now. Petrov stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes on the back of her head. Lane settled into position behind the rifle. She did not go immediately to the scope. This was the thing Sinclair noticed first, the thing that made the fist tighten. Every other candidate had gone straight to the optics. Immediate, instinctive, reaching for the trusted instrument. Lane was looking at the valley with her naked eye, not buying time, not managing nerves, watching with the attention of someone who had done the hard work already and was now waiting for a specific thing to confirm itself. What's she doing? Doyle said, very quietly. Watching, Sinclair said. Watching what? Sinclair moved his eye to the scope and slowly traversed it across the valley floor. He was looking for what she was looking for. He found it after 25 seconds. A rotation in the frost crystals near the valley bottom, a pattern, subtle, easy to miss if you were looking at it while someone else was asking you questions, and the pressure of 11 men waiting for you to do something was filling all available attention. He had been working this range for 11 years. He had never noticed it. Chief, he said to himself, not quite aloud. Doyle leaned in. What? Sinclair didn't answer. He was watching the rotation. He was counting. 14 seconds, he counted it again. 14 seconds. His jaw moved once. His hand on the spotting scope tightened fractionally. Because what he was looking at was not consistent with the range documentation. And if what he was looking at was correct, then Lane had spent 2 hours on the valley rim the previous evening and had found a thing that 28 years and 600 candidates and every instructor who had ever worked this range had not found. And what she was doing right now was not stubbornness, and it was not hope, and it was not the kind of determination that makes people attempt impossible things without adequate preparation. What she was doing was waiting for the window. She pressed her cheek to the stock. The position was what happened when something moves past technique into something deeper. Not mechanical correctness, but the correctness of a thing that has become instinct. Her body wasn't maintaining the position. The position simply was. She found the target in the scope. At this distance, it was small, not impossibly small. She had been engaging comparable dimensions at comparable ranges for years. But small, in this specific valley, Under these specific conditions, with 10 missed attempts preceding her, and Amanda who had told the story of what was not possible before she fired. That small was a different kind of problem. She took a breath, let it out, found the bottom of the exhale, didn't fire, let the window pass, took the next breath. The group behind her ratcheted up 1 degree. A full minute had passed since she settled into position. Long. Not disqualifyingly long, but long enough that candidates were exchanging glances. Petrov didn't exchange anything with anyone. Ruiz beside him said barely above a murmur, "What is she waiting for?" Petrov said nothing. "Seriously," Ruiz started. "Quiet," Petrov said. "Just the word." Not harshly. Like the word itself was a line, and he was simply placing it. Ruiz went quiet. Lane was counting. She had noted the valley's last rotation before she settled into position. She was at 9. The 14-second cycle, at its 12th second, reached its point of minimum interference. The moment when the thermal rotation's angular displacement from the bullet's path dropped to a value she could work within. The window lasted approximately a second and a half. In a second and a half at this velocity across this distance, the variable didn't disappear. It became manageable. Her father had said, "You don't beat conditions you can't control. You wait for the conditions to give you what you need, and you are ready when they do." She was ready. 11 seconds. She let the breath complete. Found the pause at the bottom, that still half second between empty and filling, the moment he had called the quiet moment, the only moment when the body is genuinely at rest. 12 seconds. The mirage between her and the target shifted. The heat shimmer that had been moving in one direction changed orientation. A subtle thing, less than a degree, but she had been watching it for 3 minutes, and she knew what it looked like when it was wrong, and she knew what it looked like right now. There. She didn't think. Thinking was for the preparation, this was for the trust. She fired. The rifle moved. The sound broke across the valley and came back from both walls, a doubled report that rolled away into the cold northern air and faded. Nobody breathed. Sinclair was at the scope. He had the target centered. He was watching. 1 second. 1.5. 2. The round's time of flight at this range, and this temperature was approximately 1.9 seconds. Sinclair had known this number for 11 years. At 2.1 seconds, he heard it. The flat, clean, unmistakable sound of hardened steel meeting a round that had traveled exactly as far as it was sent, arriving at exactly the place it was aimed. It came back from the valley 2 seconds later. Sinclair pulled his eye from the scope. He looked at Doyle. Doyle was staring at him with an expression that Sinclair had never, in 11 years of working with him, seen on that face. Something open and unguarded and slightly short of composed. "Confirmed hit," Sinclair said. His voice was completely flat. Because if he let into his voice even a fraction of what he was actually feeling, it would come out as something that was not appropriate for a warrant officer on an active qualification range. "Confirmed," Doyle said. His voice was slightly less flat. And then everything happened at once. Strand made a sound that was not quite a word. Something involuntary, from somewhere below the level where words form. His hands were on top of his head, and he was looking at the valley, and then at Lane, and then at the valley again. Ruiz said quietly and with complete sincerity, "Holy God." Brandt turned in a slow full circle, like he needed to confirm that the environment he was standing in was the same one he'd been standing in 30 seconds ago. Petrov turned away from the range. He turned his back to it and stood there and put one hand over his mouth, and nobody looked at him during that moment, which was the correct decision. Lane was still in position. She had not moved. She was behind the rifle, at the firing line, looking through the scope at a target 28 years of this program had been told was beyond what physics allowed. Then she stood up. She stepped back. She turned around. She looked at the faces of the 10 men looking at her, at Sinclair, at Doyle, and then she looked at Harwick. Harwick had not moved. He was standing exactly where he had been when he said those words. Not 28 years, not ever. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and he was looking at her with an expression that was happening at a depth that was not available for display. It was not anger. It was past anger. It was what anger becomes when it runs out of something to hold on to. Something underneath that had been using the anger as a wall for a long time. Nobody spoke. Petrov turned back around. Sinclair cleared his throat. "Confirmed hit," he said again, formally, loudly the way confirmations get made when they need to enter the record, clearly. Qualification standard. Round 1. Center mass. Nobody cheered. Not immediately. The thing that had just happened was still finding the right category in 11 different minds, and some things take longer than a breath to categorize. Strand started it. Of course he did. He started clapping. Single, deliberate, spaced. Not celebration, something more like the kind of acknowledgement you give a thing that has gone beyond what ordinary acknowledgement was built to handle. Ruiz joined him. Then Brandt. Then Doyle, who set his clipboard down and clapped with both hands in a way that suggested he had stopped caring about what was appropriate for an instructor. Then Petrov. Petrov's clap was two hands, once hard. The clap of someone who had started this course in one place and had ended up somewhere else and was acknowledging the distance without making a speech about it. It built. Harwick stood at the back and did not clap, but he did not look away. He looked at Nora Lane, standing at the firing line of a qualification standard that had held against every previous attempt for 28 years. And whatever was moving across his face was moving at a depth that hadn't been touched in a long time. Lane let it wash over her for 5 seconds. Then she picked up her rifle, slung it, walked off the line. She walked to a point 20 feet from the group, far enough for a moment of her own, close enough that she wasn't hiding. She reached into the breast pocket of her field jacket. The photograph was worn at the edges. A man and a girl, 11 years old, sitting on a granite ridge in the Gatineau Hills. Binoculars around the girl's neck. The man with a spotting scope pointed at a distance that looked impossibly far. On the back, in her own handwriting from the night her father died, were 3 lines. She didn't need to read them. She knew what they said the same way she knew the natural pause at the bottom of an exhale. She stood there for a long time, long enough that when she became aware of her surroundings again, the group had mostly moved back toward the facility, and the range was beginning to resume the ordinary business of a place that had just witnessed something and was slowly returning to itself. Almost everyone had gone. One person hadn't. Harwick was standing 10 feet away. He had been there long enough that he had clearly watched her with the photograph and had not interrupted it, and was not interrupting it now. He was there in the particular way of a man who has something he needs to say and has not yet determined how to begin. Lane put the photograph back in her pocket. She looked at him. For the first time in 6 weeks, the look between them had no current running through it. No pressure, no assessment, no managed distance. Just two people on opposite sides of something that had shifted. Harwick looked at the valley, then back at her. "How long were you on the rim?" he asked. "Last night. 2 hours. You found the rotation." "Yes, sir." He was quiet. "In 28 years, he said, no one has done that. Gone up there and stayed long enough to find the pattern." She said nothing. He said, "I looked at the original facility design documentation this morning. The installation team noted the thermal behavior in the initial survey. They classified it as too irregular to be operationally significant." He paused. "They weren't watching the right things," Lane said quietly. Harwick looked at her. Something in that answer had landed somewhere specific inside him. "No," he said after a moment. "They weren't." Another silence. The valley sent wind across the distance between them. The kind of wind that has been moving through rock and spruce for longer than anyone who has ever stood in this valley has been alive. "My brother's name was Samuel," Harwick said. She went still. She had expected many things from this conversation. An acknowledgement, formal and contained. A comment on the shot. A careful managed cessation of the 6 weeks of pressure. She had not expected this. "He was 24 years old," Harwick said. His voice had set something down that it had been carrying. "He was in selection for a special operations unit. He was exceptional. The best physical specimen in our family, the most technically gifted, the one our father always pointed to when he talked about what a soldier should be. He was certain he was going to pass. So were the people running the program." Harwick stopped, collected something. "He didn't pass," he said. And the way he didn't pass, the specific mechanism, was not the training. It was the culture around the training. The expectation that certain people would fail. The pressure applied not to improve him, but to confirm the conclusion that had already been reached. He absorbed it for 7 weeks, and then he internalized it. And that internalization did something to him that the training itself never would have. She was completely still. He looked at her. "I have spent 16 years believing that I was running a hard program for the right reasons," he said. "That the people who left were protected by their leaving. That my job was to know, before a candidate knew themselves, whether this was going to cost them something they couldn't recover." His jaw moved once. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong about what it means to protect someone, and I was wrong about the cost of deciding that for them without asking." It was the most she had ever heard Harwick say in a single breath that was not about instruction or command. She looked at him. "I'm sorry about Samuel," she said. "I mean that." He nodded once. I know you do, he said. The wind moved through the valley again. Your father, Harwick said. He taught you to watch the way you watched last night. She thought about it. He taught me how to look, she said. What I did with it was mine. Harwick held her gaze, and for the first time since she had arrived at his program, he looked at her without the wall. Just a man, just a woman, and standing in a valley in northern Ontario where history had shifted by one confirmed hit and 2 hours of patient watching in the cold. Sergeant Lane, he said. Sir, that is the finest technical achievement I have witnessed in 16 years of running this program. She held his gaze. Thank you, sir, she said. He nodded once, clean and final. Then he turned and walked back toward the facility, and his walk was the same as it had always been, the walk of a man who carried authority without performing it. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed by a few degrees. Not much, but at this distance, a few degrees was the difference between a miss and center mass. Sinclair was waiting by the facility door. He had watched the whole exchange from 40 feet away, with the attention he gave anything that mattered. When Harwick reached him, Sinclair read his commanding officer's face the way he read everything, with experience, with attention, with the willingness to accept what was actually there, rather than what he'd expected. What he saw made him exhale slowly. Well, Sinclair said. Don't, Harwick said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were. Sinclair considered this. I was going to say it considerably more diplomatically than you're imagining, he said. And Harwick, for the first time 6 weeks, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Half a second. Gone. But it had been there. That evening, Strand found her sitting outside the facility on a bench in the cold, the photograph in her hands again. He sat down beside her without asking, which was right. Asking would have made it formal. He looked at the photograph, the man with the spotting scope, the girl with the binoculars, and the grin. Your dad, he said. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. He would have loved today, Strand said. She looked at the photograph for a long time. He did love today, she said quietly. He loved it a long time before it happened. Strand didn't say anything to that. There was nothing that needed saying. He just sat there, in the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something and don't need to fill it. After a while, Petrov came out and sat on the ground nearby, back against the wall. Then Ruiz, then Brandt and 2 of the others, and it built without anyone organizing it, until there were 8 of them sitting outside in the northern Ontario cold, and the conversation moved the way it moves when people have stopped performing and started talking, slowly, then easily, then into the kinds of things that only get said after something shared has stripped the pretension off. Petrov was the last to arrive. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the group, and something was working in his face, whether this was a place he'd earned, whether he had the right to it. Then he walked over and sat at the far end of the bench, and nobody acknowledged it, and everybody noticed it. After a few minutes, he said, without looking at her directly, I said something the first morning. On the line before Harwick came out. To Ruiz, the group went slightly quieter. I said it loud enough that you could hear it if you were paying attention, he said. She looked at him. You heard it, yes, she said. I was wrong, he said. Flat, no cushioning, no explanation designed to make the admission easier on himself, just the words. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. That's it? He looked almost not offended, surprised, like he had prepared for a longer conversation. What else would there be? She said. You were wrong. You figured it out. You did something about it. That's the correct sequence? Petrov looked away. His jaw moved at the angle that meant he was giving something the weight it deserved. Your father teach you that too? He said. Everybody taught me that, she said. Him, the army, 2 deployments. You. A pause. People teach you things whether they mean to or not, she said. The formal qualification ceremony was 3 days later, back at Gagetown. The families of some candidates had come. There were senior officers present, whose attendance at a program of this classification level was not standard procedure, and which communicated something without saying it directly. Sinclair told her, quietly in the hallway before the ceremony, that 2 general officers had specifically requested to attend this graduation. 2, she said. 2, he confirmed. He paused. The northern shot traveled, he said. These things do. She nodded slowly. Chief, she said. He looked at her. Thank you for the spotting scope on the 1200. For Sinclair allowed himself for exactly 1 second to not be a warrant officer on a professional schedule. In 11 years, he said, I have watched 3 shots that made me stop what I was doing and just look at the target. He paused. Yours was all 3 at once. He walked back into the hall before she could answer. Probably intentional. The ceremony moved efficiently. Names called, Qualifications recorded, candidates stepping forward with the bearing of people who understood what they'd earned and had no need to display it. When they called Lane's name, something changed in the room. The specific atmospheric change of a room that has been collectively holding something and chooses simultaneously to release it. One of the general officers present stood up when she stepped forward. A general officer standing when a name is called is a statement. Two of them standing is something that doesn't happen according to any protocol. Then Sinclair stood up, then Doyle, then the other officers, then all 10 of the other graduates who had been standing at attention in the line, stepped off it to stand and clap. The families in the room who did not fully understand what was being marked, but understood that it was significant, stood as well. Petrov was on his feet before the applause fully built, standing straight, clapping with both hands, in his face. A man who was glad to be in the room and not trying to hide it. Strand, in the graduate line, was not managing to keep his expression within regulation standards. His eyes were doing something that had nothing to do with the overhead lighting. Lane accepted her qualification from the senior officer's hands directly, also not protocol, and he said something to her that the room wasn't close enough to hear. Later, when people asked Strand what was said, he told them he didn't know. When they asked Petrov, Petrov said he didn't know either. When they asked Lane, she smiled, a real one, the kind that gets into the eyes, and said something her father would have agreed with. Nobody pushed further. Then, after the formal portion had closed and the room had shifted into the informal space that follows these things, Harwick crossed the room. He crossed it directly, without hurry, without performance. Just a man moving from where he'd been standing to where she was standing, with clear intention. The room tracked it. He stopped in front of her. He reached into the breast pocket of his dress jacket and removed a small envelope. He held it in both hands for a moment, which was not how envelopes are typically held, and the atypical way of holding it communicated something about the weight he was giving it. "This is a formal performance commendation," he said. "My signature. Submitted through the chain of command this morning. It includes a recommendation for accelerated promotion review and a citation for the highest individual qualification score in the documented history of this program." He extended it. She took it. "Not as compensation," Harwick said. His voice was low enough that it was effectively a private conversation in a room full of people. "Not as an acknowledgement of pressure applied from above. As recognition," he said, "earned over 6 weeks by a soldier who is better at this than anyone I have assessed in 16 years. The room was quiet in the particular way of a room that is choosing not to interrupt a moment. Lane looked at the envelope, then at him. "What changed?" she asked. Quietly, directly, the way she asked everything. He was quiet for a moment. "I told you about Samuel," he said. "Yes." "What I didn't tell you," he said, "is that 2 weeks before he broke, he asked me whether I thought he belonged there." His jaw tightened once. "I told him I wasn't sure," he said. The silence between them was dense. "I have never forgiven myself for that," he said, "and somewhere between that and here I made that everyone else's problem." He looked at her steadily. "That is not an excuse. It is an explanation." "I know the difference," she said. "I spent 6 weeks trying to make you walk away." He said it plainly, without flinching from it. "You didn't, wasn't stubbornness. It was because you had something worth staying for." She looked at him for a long moment. "So did Samuel," she said quietly. Something moved through Harwick's face, fast and private and very deep. "Yes," he said, after a moment. "He did." He straightened. "Congratulations, Sergeant Lane," he said, "on a qualification standard that 28 years of this program held as the limit, and on 6 weeks that I intend to think about for a long time." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip held one beat past the formal. In that beat was everything that had no words for it. He nodded once, turned, walked back across the room. Petrov, standing 8 feet away, had watched all of it. She looked back at him. "Close your mouth," she said. He closed it. "Was that? Yes? Did he just?" "Yes." Petrov looked at Harwick's back for a long moment. "Huh," he said. For Petrov, that was an entire speech. That night, after the reception, after the administrative processing, after the long, particular conversations that happen at the end of hard things when people are trying to find the right way to say goodbye without making it too big. Lane went back to the barracks alone. She sat on the edge of her bunk. She took the photograph out of her pocket one more time. The man and the girl on the Gatineau Ridge, the binoculars, the spotting scope pointed at the distance, the grin on the girl's face that didn't know yet what the world was going to ask of her. She thought about the quiet room, about being 7 years old and learning that silence was information, about his hands at the end thinner than they should have been, and his voice that was mostly breath, and what he had said. You already know everything I taught you. The rest is just distance. She reached into her kit and found the small notebook she had carried since the week of his funeral. She opened it to the page. She had opened it to 100 times. His voice transcribed in her handwriting. 3 lines. Serve with honor, never quit. Become the soldier they said you couldn't be. She read each one. She had read them in forward operating bases and in transport aircraft and in the particular dark of the hour before operations that she was not allowed to describe in detail. She had read them exhausted and afraid and alone, in the specific way that people are alone when they are surrounded by others and still carrying something no one else can see. She took a pen from her jacket. She held it over the 3rd line. Then she drew a single check mark beside it. She sat with that for a long time. The photograph, the completed list. The window outside, showing the dark northern Ontario sky and the particular quality of winter stars that come out when the air is cold enough. To be honest, she did not cry immediately. She sat with it first, the fullness of it. The weight of the thing finished, and the grief and the relief and the gratitude, all occupying the same space at once, the way they do when you stop holding them separately. Then she cried, not loudly, not with any performance. In the way that private grief looks quiet from the outside and is complete from the inside. The body releasing 6 weeks and 31 years, and every promise made in the thin lamplight of a room where a man she loved was running out of breath. She cried for her father. She cried for Samuel Harwick, who had asked the wrong man whether he belonged and received the wrong answer, and had never fully recovered. She cried for every soldier who had stood at a door and been told the architecture of the room meant the door wasn't theirs. She cried for the girl in the photograph who was grinning behind a pair of binoculars almost too big for her face, pointing at a distance that seemed impossibly far, with no idea yet what it was going to cost to close it. When she was done, she closed the notebook. She placed the photograph back in the breast pocket over her heart. She sat up, she breathed, and in the quiet of that small room, at the end of the longest 6 weeks of her life, Sergeant First Class Nora Lane made one final decision, not a promise. She had made all her promises. She had kept them, a decision. She decided that what had happened in that valley was not an ending. It was a beginning, not for her record, not for the commendation in the envelope in her kit, though both of those things were real and would matter. For every soldier who came after. For every woman who would stand on a line somewhere and find a room full of people who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. For every person who had been told that physics defined the limit, that the conditions were too complex, the target too small, the window too short, and who had almost believed it. She thought about something her father had said, sitting on a rock on the Gatineau Ridge, when she was 12 years old and frustrated because a shot she had been working on for 2 weeks still wasn't consistent. He had put his hand on her shoulder. Claire, he'd said. He was the only person who called her that. Everyone else had always said Nora, but he had called her Claire from the time she was small, and she had never asked why, and now she would never know. Great shooters hit targets. But that's not what this is actually about. She had looked at him. What's it about? He had looked at the valley below them, at the distance that had been teaching them both for as long as she could remember. Great soldiers, he said. Change what people believe is possible. She had been 12. She hadn't fully understood it. She understood it now. In the years that followed, every woman who entered the Canadian Forces Advanced Targeting and Reconnaissance Program heard the story before they fired their first shot at the qualification range. Petrov told it at leadership symposiums for a decade, with the directness he brought to everything and the specific credibility of a man who stated plainly that he had started out on the wrong side of it. Strand told it the way people tell stories that changed them, not as history but as something still alive. Sinclair told it once, at his retirement, in a room full of people who had worked the program, and he told it in the particular flat way that warrant officers tell things that matter most to them, without decoration, and it was better for that. And always, the story ended the same way. A valley in November. A pattern in the frost. 14 seconds, a window of 1.5 around that traveled exactly as far as it was sent. A sound coming back from the rock walls of a valley that had held its silence for 28 years. The story ended there. But what the story left behind was larger than the story and longer, and it traveled forward into every cohort that came after, through every candidate who stood at a line and heard it and understood. Not that the conditions were fair, not that the room had been ready to believe before she proved it, but that ready had never been the point. The point was the watching. The 2 hours on the cold granite rim, the patience that her father had built into her before the world knew what it was building toward. The valley still stands in northern Ontario. The qualification standard still hangs at distance between walls of Canadian shield granite that have been there since before there were people to stand and look at them. The thermal rotation still cycles every 14 seconds, patient and indifferent to the soldiers who come to the rim and watch or don't watch, understand or fail to understand. And the target that held its silence for 28 years now holds a different kind of history. The kind that rings out across a valley, the kind you can still hear if you're listening the way a father taught his daughter to listen, on a ridge in the Gatineau Hills, pointing at a distance that seemed too far, before either of them knew how far it would eventually reach.